A classical Renaissance presents a collection of paintings belonging not so much to the modern or postmodern art world as to an ancient tradition. Flouting the rule of the painter of modern life, of Edouard Manet and Honoré Daumier, that an artist must be of his time, my paintings follow another rule of art which was taught in the old academies and held sway for hundreds of years before their demise in the early 20th century. Not to appear out of date, one of the recommendations that I received from the committee which reviewed my proposal for this exhibition was to include something more contemporary, to which I was tempted to reply that everything I do is timeless, though the committee member made a fair point. The significance of academic art is not self-explanatory to a contemporary audience, and so allow me to explain what it is that I do and why it matters. The story behind this body of work began more than 10 years ago in 2009, when I graduated from art school. I received my training in drawing and painting in the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance at a school in Florence called the Angel Academy, just blocks away from the original Academy of Painting and Sculpture, founded by Giorgio Vasari in 1563. The Angel Academy is part of the Atelier movement, which also includes the Florence Academy, the Grand Central Atelier, and the Academy of Realist Art here in Boston, among many others. The ateliers have done a wonderful job of training a whole generation of painters in a skill set which for much of the 20th century was all but lost, thanks to the repudiation of fine craftsmanship by modern and postmodern artists. Initially, the new academicism was called classical realism, which is a passable description of academic art, though this name has waned in popularity in recent years. My work is very classical, but most of the work being produced by other artists in the movement is not, and not all of it can be described as realism either. After a mere 2 decades, our work has already become too diverse to be easily classified as a particular school or style. The academic tradition has always fostered a great diversity of styles, ranging from Mannerism in the 16th century to Bolognese classicism and Caravagism in the 17th century, to the Rococo and Neoclassicism in the 18th century, to name just a few. Though there was always a unifying thread connecting the diverse schools and styles of academic art. From the Accademia in Florence to the French Academy in Paris to the Royal Academy in London, there was a common idea of art, first articulated in antiquity and reiterated by theorists of the Renaissance. From the publication of the first Renaissance treatise on painting by Leon Battista Alberti in 1435, until the arrival of Romanticism in the late 18th century, it was taken for granted that the art of painting had a certain nature, which was succinctly expressed by simple theoretical principles, and which was the same everywhere and for all times. Painting was an imitation of nature, and its end was beauty. This nature was given unique expression, but not fundamentally changed by the idiosyncrasies of an artist's style or of a given school. The idea that art should be beautiful and imitate nature, also known as classical mimesis, was common sense to ancient and medieval people alike, because it was taken for granted that nature is the definitive work of art, crafted by a divine craftsman. There was no debate about what art is, because the nature of art was believed to be manifest in the original act of creation. In Plato's account of the creation in the Timaeus, the divine craftsman creates by imitation of ideal forms, and he does so not for any instrumental purpose, as if he had any need of it, but for beauty's sake, as the creation serves no other purpose but to manifest the goodness of its creator. By imitating nature beautifully, the artist emulates the divine craftsman, and by improving upon nature in imitation of the ideal, even enters into lively competition with him, according to the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus. Classical art was a self-conscious reenactment of the primordial act of creation, and so was the art of the Renaissance, taking not only Plato's Timaeus, but also the story of creation in Genesis as a prototype. The Renaissance painter improved upon classical art by separating the light from the darkness in chiaroscuro, and by separating the heavens from the earth with an horizon line in linear perspective. With particular attention to the human form, the Renaissance painter reenacted the creation of man by making images of the image of God, quite literally from the dust of the earth. Of course, classical art would not have needed to be rediscovered in the Middle Ages had the doctrine of creation, in which medieval Christians had always believed, been sufficient to arrive at a classical conception of art. There is, in fact, another metaphysical belief which is just as important to classical art, and happens to have been ascendant within scholastic philosophy at the very moment that the Italian Renaissance began, circa 1300, namely a belief in realism, the deceptively simple idea that things have a nature which can be known. Realism is the fundamental premise of classical mimesis, since it would obviously be impossible to imitate nature if nature were unknowable. One knows from ordinary experience that it is the nature of a stone to be hard, the nature of the sky to be blue, and the nature of a human being to walk on two legs. From the common sense perspective of English empiricists like John Locke or Samuel Johnson, who refuted Bishop Berkeley's skepticism by kicking a stone, the fact that one has empirical knowledge of the nature of things is not even debatable, though from a properly metaphysical perspective, a nature is not just a list of parts and effects, but what St. Thomas Aquinas would call an essence. What metaphysical realism proposes is that the essential nature of things can be known and represented. Were it impossible to know what things really are in themselves, nature could not be imitated beyond a soulless transcription of sense impressions, and classical mimesis would succumb to Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis. Plato famously doubted the ability of painting and sculpture to speak the truth, as a mere imitation of appearances, 2 steps removed from the ultimate reality of the ideal forms. Plato's metaphysics aside, everyone will agree that if painting amounted to nothing more than handmade photography, it wouldn't amount to very much. The premise of classical art is that there is an answer to Plato's critique, a means by which to grasp the essence of things and reveal the soul inhering in the body. Good art hits the target by showing what things really are, to paraphrase the 18th century English painter Jonathan Richardson. Alberti remarks in his treatise On Painting that a painter must clearly understand what he is attempting to do, because he draws the bow in vain who has nowhere to point the arrow, which is a good description of the conundrum of contemporary art. Even today, a painting is still made by an artist and composed of paint on a flat plane, though what is not so obvious anymore are the form and the purpose of painting. What Aristotle would term efficient and material causes can still be known, but formal and final causes have become mysteriously inscrutable. No one can say what it is that makes a painting the kind of thing that it is, or to what end a painter strives, because postmodern people do not believe in metaphysical realism, much less in the doctrine of creation. Once the march of the avant-garde reached its terminus in the early to mid-20th century, having discarded art's immemorial purpose as well as the skills needed to attain it, artists had no target left at which to aim. As the philosopher Boris Groys has observed, art became non-teleological, which is philosophical jargon for a basketball game without a hoop. Having become indifferent to beauty, the modern artist had no other objective with which to replace it. Taking leave of the imitation of nature, modern art became formless and void, as in Kazimir Malevich's Black Square. For want of any spirit of God hovering over the deep, the modern artist lost his prototype, and modern art became a representation of a sublime, watery abyss, retelling the story of creation in the absence of a creator. Hence, the thesis of postmodern art, announced by Marcel Duchamp's fountain at the annual exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in 1917, is that art does not have a general essence anymore. Duchamp's tongue-in-cheek exposition of an upside-down urinal was intended to turn each of Aristotle's 4 causes on its head. Duchamp presented a work which he did not make, and he signed it with a name that was not his own. He eschewed materials proper to painting and sculpture, and made no attempt to imitate nature, and gave no thought to beauty, thereby deconstructing all that constitutes art's essential nature. There is no such thing as art, quote-unquote, proclaimed Marcel Duchamp, but only objects called by that name. Art is whatever the art world says it is. Of course, even as the postmodern art world has put anti-essentialism into practice by marketing self-consciously worthless rubbish for extraordinary prices and putting the same on display in our museums, the market for old masters has paradoxically continued to confirm the inexorable logic of realism. Consider, for example, the works of Rembrandt. No matter how convincing a 19th century forgery of a Rembrandt might be, the forgery loses all value should it be found out, because it lacks something essential, namely the hand of the master. Even if a forgery perfectly replicates the style of the master, a challenging but not impossible feat, it will still lose all value should it be discovered under the microscope that anachronistic synthetic pigments have been used. Moreover, of those paintings that are autograph originals by Rembrandt, their value will vary considerably according to quality. The most valuable masterpiece is the one that most perfectly expresses the style of the master, constituting his most beautiful imitation of nature. The belief which everyone takes for granted that an original is more valuable than a forgery, or that a masterpiece is more valuable than a sketch, implies that the works of a master share a general essence, which the forgery lacks and the masterpiece most perfectly expresses. Being by the hand of Rembrandt, of materials that Rembrandt used, in the form of Rembrandt's style, and an undeniably beautiful imitation of nature, the works of Rembrandt have a nature which can be known and is determined by Aristotle's four causes. By selectively applying the assumptions of metaphysical realism to the old masters, but not to postmodern art, the art world acts as if old master paintings exist in a universe in which realism is true, while postmodern art exists in another universe where realism is false. The advantage of being an open-minded, postmodern neoliberal pluralist is that one doesn't have to believe in the law of non-contradiction. The market can accommodate as many different realities as postmodern culture can make up. Unfortunately, anyone who recalcitrantly believes in the principles of logic cannot be so accommodating, which is why the Atelier movement has generally assumed a militant tone toward the postmodern art world and gravitated toward reactionary conservatism, following the lead of the Art Renewal Center, an organization which has brought the various schools together around competitions and scholarships. The founder of the ARC, Fred Ross, has been personally responsible for turning the Atelier movement into a revival specifically of 19th century French academicism and placing William Bouguereau on the seat of Michelangelo. Much as I admire Bouguereau's paintings, my only reservation about this reactionary conservatism is that it's not reactionary enough, but has, to all appearances, conserved some of the revolutionary ideas which reduced fine art to its present condition. It cannot suffice merely to return to the 19th century, when the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment and Romanticism were already prevalent in the 19th century and exerted an influence even over the most curmudgeonly academicians of that era. Enlightenment rationalism and romantic individualism changed the way that artists understood the nature of art by insidiously separating its form from its purpose. From the perspective of an Enlightenment rationalist, what mattered most was a rationalistic conception of form, consisting of whatever could be measured and precisely transcribed from direct observation, as illustrated perhaps by the works of Jean-Léon Gérôme or Ernest Meissonier, for example. The question of art's purpose scarcely entered into this rationalistic transcription of appearances as a disinterested scientific enterprise. From the perspective of a romantic like Eugène Delacroix, by contrast, having a purpose mattered a great deal, quite irrespective of what purpose that happened to be. For the romantic, what really mattered was authenticity, a sincere commitment to an end of one's own choosing. In either case, the formal cause of the craft was separated from its final cause. The imitation of nature was divorced from beauty and entered into a custody battle with it. Why should the imitation of nature be beautiful? Asked Gustave Courbet. when nature is not always beautiful? Is ugliness not an equally meritorious goal? Asked Francisco Goya. The craft was thus reduced to a box of soulless tools, which had no inner teleology and which promptly became obsolete. Falling predictably either into the category of photographic transcriptive naturalism or romantic self-expression, most of the work produced by the Atelier movement is not of a kind which Giorgio Vasari would have recognized as belonging to the academic tradition which he founded. From long experience, I can attest that my peers do not feel the sting of this criticism because nobody cares about fidelity to the tradition as such. Everyone blithely imposes his own purposes on the craft as if it had no intrinsic purpose, and in so doing, we unwittingly confirm the thesis of postmodern art, myself included at one point in time. Anti-essentialism has become so natural as to be taken for granted. Thus, the difficulty of reviving the craft is not just a matter of recovering a skill set. The real challenge is that academic art both proceeds from and sets up a world which is not our own. It expresses a worldview which contemporary artists do not have. Academicism died in the early 20th century because it did not express the way that modern people see reality. When I arrived in Italy in 2006, I knew that there was something wrong with putting an upside-down urinal on display in a museum and calling it art, but I couldn't say what precisely. I had no idea of the philosophical premises of modern and postmodern art, much less did I realize to what extent I took the same erroneous beliefs for granted. All I knew was that I didn't care for the postmodern art world, and I was on the lookout for an alternative. Upon encountering Renaissance Italy, I found a world more to my liking, and so I decided to try it on for size. My education in Italy instilled a natural desire to do what artists of the Italian Renaissance had done, being the most natural use of the skills I had acquired. Finding Enlightenment rationalism absurd and romantic individualism paralyzing, I looked to the tradition from which my skills derived, to give me an ideal at which to aim. I wanted to paint the Holy Family and the Pietà because Correggio had painted them. I wanted to paint Bacchus and Ariadne and Venus and Adonis because Titian had done so before me. Nothing I might have contrived could rise to a higher standard of spiritual or historical seriousness than canonical subject matter, and so I confined myself to the canon. It was all perfectly logical. The fact that I was not a medieval Catholic or a Renaissance humanist did not deter me, because I did not intend to impose my amorphous individuality on the tradition, but to find my identity as an artist by embodying the tradition. I was not interested in expressing my own point of view, but sought rather to understand how Renaissance artists saw reality, because I found their vision compelling. It was only after turning to the primary sources, beginning with Alberti's treatise on painting, that I discovered the deceptively simple objective of the craft, to show what things really are. Straightforward as this may sound, according to modern skeptics such as Immanuel Kant, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, the goal of classical mimesis is, in fact, impossible. Modern philosophers have almost all agreed that what things really are in themselves lies beyond the limits of representation. And even St. Thomas Aquinas once said that the efforts of human thought cannot so much as plumb the essence of a single gnat. Yet the Renaissance painter nonetheless dared to paint that whereof Wittgenstein could not speak, the noumena beyond the reach of Kantian reason, the very thing in itself. In effect, the goal of classical mimesis is to perform a miracle by opening the eyes of the blind. The cause of our blindness, as philosophers have always recognized, is that reality disappears behind a veil of appearances, and it is further obscured by familiarity and thoughtless instrumentality. In time, one ceases to see anything at all, except what one already knows. Who needs eyes when one has knowledge? Who needs taste when reality has been pre-digested? Who needs ears to hear oneself speak? Fine art awakens dormant senses. By representing reality on canvas or panel, A painting calls attention to all that one has learned to ignore. A painter studies what others take for granted. He looks, and then he looks again, not simply imposing his preconceptions upon nature, but allowing nature to be a model of itself, and abstracting out an intelligible form from it. To answer Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis, a painting must amount to something more than handmade photography. As Sir Joshua Reynolds explains in his discourses, an artist must improve upon nature by means of an ideal form which he derives from nature. A painting should be, quote, more true than truth itself, as the French theorist Roger de Pile put it, by which he meant more true to the essential nature of things than the simple appearance of things. To the credit of my teachers at the Angel Academy, the constant refrain which was pounded into my head when I was a student was precisely this, that our objective was to paint form, and not just to copy what we saw. The naive transcription of appearances has no volume, no depth, and no structure, and so a painter must learn to create such effects by following the principles of chiaroscuro, linear perspective, and anatomical construction, for example. To make a painting look realistic, one must paint an idea of form, hence the title of Giovanni Bellori's seminal essay on the theory of art, quote, The Idea of the Painter, the Sculptor, and the Architect, which Bellori delivered in a lecture to the Academy of St. Luke in Rome in 1664. To paint an idea of form is already to begin to answer the charge of soullessness, because the soul is in fact defined as the form of the body. Hardly a mysterious homunculus located in the pineal gland, as René Descartes apparently believed. The soul is what gives both shape and life to the body, making it the kind of thing that it is. The soul signifies the divided nature of a human being, as a lump of matter, but of a strangely active, self-organizing kind. There is a pitfall of which the idealizer must beware, because idealization can easily deteriorate into mannerism or worse still, into a bland, generic form lacking any particular character. Acutely aware of this danger, the most idealizing of academic painters, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, never permitted himself merely to impose a more geometric order on the asymmetries of nature, but availed himself of nature's eccentricities, and at times even exaggerated them, for reasons that are best explained by the difference between Aristotle's metaphysics and Plato's. A Platonist would say that the essence of a human being is the human soul, anima essentia est, to which an Aristotelian would object that a human being is not just a soul, but also a body. While the soul is what makes the body human, the body is what gives the soul its individuality. The ideal conceived merely as a distillation of what things of a kind share in common is not what is ultimately real, because real souls are individuated. Hence, to paint things as they really are, the painter must capture both the universal and the particular at a single stroke of the brush, achieving an elusive union of appearances and the ideal, which Roger de Pile dubbed the perfect truth. An artist's idea of form must constantly be refreshed and refined by direct observation, for which reason Joshua Reynolds rebuked François Boucher's deplorable practice of painting purely from imagination, a practice which I must confess to have adopted myself for reasons of necessity. The academic painter traditionally paints from life, because his purpose is to paint life, the soul being expressed above all by the movements of the body. No quality of form was more highly esteemed by the Renaissance connoisseur than movement. The best paintings depict the human body in lively, expressive action, with particular attention is stressed by the founder of the French Academy, Charles Lebrun, to such things as facial expressions and gestures, which brings us to the second corrective to mere transcriptive naturalism. Just as idealization is the formal solution to soullessness, the material solution consists of a certain kind of subject matter known as history painting. History painting is the usual, if slightly misleading, translation of the Italian name Historia, used by Alberti to refer not only to history, but to any story of great deeds which shows by example what it is to be human. Following Aristotle's instruction in the Poetics, the history painter imitates, quote, the action of men, because man is the measure of all things, and what man really is expressed by what he does. In stark contrast to the wall of separation between painting and poetry later erected by the Enlightenment critic Gotthold Lessing, Alberti modeled his theory of painting on Ciceronian rhetoric and instructed painters to do what poets do by portraying great stories and interpreting them in a novel and ingenious way. It was this appropriation of poetic invention, the first and most important canon of rhetoric, which elevated Renaissance painting from a mere handcraft to the status of a liberal art. Aping imitation of nature may succumb to Plato's critique, but creative imitation, which follows the principles of invention, does not. As the paradigmatic solution to the soullessness of mimesis, history painting stands at the top of the academic hierarchy of genres, while landscape and portraiture fall somewhere in the middle, and at the bottom of the hierarchy is still life, being paradigmatic of the mere transcription of appearances. The omission of still life from my exhibition, as well as the descending scale of my history paintings, portraits, and landscapes, have been calculated to communicate this hierarchy. When the imitation of nature is properly understood as a means of showing what things really are, it is easy to see its integral relationship to beauty. Although the mere imitation of appearances is liable to be at odds with beauty, classical mimesis never is, because beauty is the revelation of what things really are. According to Plato, a thing is beautiful when it conforms to the ideal form of its kind, thereby revealing what it really is. Even apart from Plato's theory of forms, the gist of Plato's definition is confirmed by how we use the word. When do we call a thing beautiful, but when it shows itself for what it really is, as when a flower blossoms? When is a woman most beautiful, but when she becomes a woman? When is the sun most beautiful, but when it rises? When is a bird most beautiful, but when it takes flight? When is a local color most beautiful, but when it is clear and bright? Likewise, the work of art is most beautiful when it expresses what art really is, by showing what things really are. To make this point as clearly as possible, my portraits and landscapes focus on the simplest, most paradigmatic examples of beauty, be it a sunrise or a young woman with a rose in her hair. Following the advice of Joshua Reynolds, I also use simple, bold local colors after the grand manner of the Florentine and Roman school of Renaissance painting, as opposed to the more complex local colors and subtle textures of the Venetian school. A beautiful sight is often described using words like captivating or enthralling, both metaphors of bondage, because beauty is an experience of subjection to a power outside oneself. To see a beautiful painting is to become subject to it. The object acts upon you, and it changes you. The object takes hold and conforms the soul to itself. Beauty is the action of an object disclosing itself to a subject, the action of one being revealing itself to another being, and therefore a revelation of the transcendental properties of being, of unity, goodness, and truth. As Leon Battista Alberti explains, a painter expresses these properties by means of drawing, composition, and color. Even though there are no lines in nature, a painter expresses the unity of things by circumscribing each figure with contour lines to show its discrete corporeal integrity. A painter then uses the rules of composition to unify a painting's diverse parts, weaving the lines seamlessly together, harmonizing the local colors, unifying the shadows, and massing similar tones. A painter expresses the property of goodness by hitting the mark. Good drawing accurately represents the proportions of things, and a good composition has a proportionality within itself. Each part fits in relation to the whole in lively symmetry. Some parts come forward and others recede, creating a hierarchy of emphasis. Lastly, a painter expresses the truth of things by capturing their characteristic form in a convincing likeness. And he also expresses the truth of art by crowning a painting with a resplendence analogous to the gilded background of a Byzantine icon, but consisting instead of an overall clarity of form, which makes a painting cohere at a glance. The objective properties of beauty are thus integrity, proportion, and clarity, as St. Thomas Aquinas surmised. Contrary to the teaching of the Enlightenment, which reduced beauty to a matter of subjective aesthetic pleasure, the beauty of a painting obviously depends as much upon the objective properties of the painting as upon the subjective faculties of the viewer. Since metaphysical realism goes hand in hand with moral realism, modern and postmodern philosophers have been inclined to reject the objectivity not only of beauty, but of values in general. The philosopher Plotinus had a refutation of such skepticism, which is almost as simple, though not so fallacious, as Samuel Johnson's Argumentum ad lapidem. Consider a classical statue. Anyone can see that a classical statue is not just a chunk of marble or a lump of bronze, because there is something else inhering in it. That something else is the artist's idea of form. To perceive the beauty of a classical statue is in fact to see an idea, a real immaterial principle inhering in the work of art. The intellectual apprehension of essences, and by implication of objective values, is a brute fact of human experience, which happens every time one encounters a thing of beauty, capable of captivating the eye and conforming the soul to itself. Of course, beauty results in pleasure rather than understanding, as Immanuel Kant might object. The beautiful is irreducible to any mental representation circumscribed by a concept, because what it reveals is an idea so sublime that it cannot be measured and mastered by rationalistic methods. Disclosing reality in a mystery, beauty holds one's gaze by refusing to be exhausted by it. One looks and looks again, and still there is more to see in a beautiful painting. The mystery of being can never be fathomed, not because reality is unintelligible, but because it is infinitely intelligible, and therefore infinitely exceeds the finitude of human thought. The strangely intellectual power of the sense of sight, upon which Aristotle remarks in the opening lines of the Metaphysics, is to see, and therefore to know, what words cannot express. Wittgenstein was mistaken when he wrote in the Tractatus that all he knew was what he had words for, because reality as it presents itself to the eyes of the intellect infinitely exceeds the limits of language. The almost supernatural power of beauty is to bypass the clumsy intermediaries of reason, of representation, and of language by addressing the rational soul directly. Beauty is the goal of art and the final answer to the soullessness of mimesis. By revealing the form inhering in matter, beauty gives evidence of things unseen. Beauty is an unveiling, which does explain the paramount significance of the unveiling of the human body. The priority of the nude in classical art is not an arbitrary convention, but serves an indispensable purpose. It is the beauty of the human body above all else, which answers Plato's critique of the soullessness of mimesis, because the unveiling of the human body unveils something more than the body, namely the invisible and immaterial human soul, which revelation forestalls the appetitive inclination to objectify the body. The classical nude is surprisingly contemplative. Rather than excite the appetites, the classical nude mortifies them, as Arthur Schopenhauer observed. As a representation of the essential goodness of human nature, the classical nude is unfallen, and it invites one to experience the same prelapsarian innocence vicariously. And so you see, the form, the function, and even the subject matter of classical art are absolutely inseparable. Classical art is an imitation of nature. Beauty is its object, and the human body in lively expressive action is its subject. But what of other traditions? Does all art imitate nature, as Seneca claimed, or do other traditions take other forms for other purposes? Giorgio Vasari was certainly critical of less naturalistic traditions, such as Gothic and Byzantine art, and ironically, the usual justification for primitivism in the context of liturgical art confirms the logic of Vasari's criticism, if not necessarily his conclusion. The objective of a Byzantine icon is to make Christ or the saints present using a highly simplified, stylized idealization. Instead of grasping at reality, the primitive artist shows us a shadow of reality, a negative representation which does not presume to disclose what is hidden, but instead stands in, with all humility, like a child's stick figure, for a transcendence which cannot be contained within the borders of a frame. Byzantine art shows what things really are by veiling them. Renaissance art shows what things really are by unveiling them. Yet, this difference is only a matter of degree, as it is the nature of idealization both to reveal and to conceal the nature of things. Both Renaissance and Byzantine art have a claim on beauty, though calibrated to different contexts and different modes of engagement. The work of Renaissance art is an integral whole unto itself, and so nothing of the beauty of Renaissance art is lost when contemplated in isolation on the walls of an art museum. The Byzantine icon or mosaic, by contrast, is made to be part of a greater whole, and so it is transformed entirely when experienced in the liturgical space in which it belongs, serving its liturgical purpose. The beautiful architecture, ceremonies, and gilding surrounding the icon are the unveiling of a truth that the icon conceals behind an unprepossessing caricature. All art is mimetic, predicated like the craft of Plato's divine craftsman upon the imitation of an idea of form. The premises of Renaissance art are truly universal. They are able to explain the logic of diverse traditions, and they are able to provide a fully objective standard by which to judge the merits of diverse traditions. Some kinds of art really are better than others, because they do a better job of expressing what art really is. To make good art, one doesn't necessarily have to be a medieval Catholic or a Renaissance humanist or even a classical academician, but one does have to be a realist. A good artist certainly cannot be an anti-essentialist, because anyone who denies that there is a target cannot possibly hit the target. One must believe that there is an objective reality, not only of facts, but also of values, which can be known, and to which one should conform oneself. There is no other attitude toward reality that works in practice. All else ends in folly and human misery. We have only to look around at the art which has occupied our museums to see the folly of anti-essentialism on full display. As an aestheticized object of disinterested pleasure on the walls of a museum or art gallery, a painting is presented to the world both as a thing to be revered and as a thing to be judged. Like Pilate presenting Christ to the mob with the words Ecce Homo, behold the man, the art gallery announces to the public with each exhibition, Ecce Pictura, behold the painting. And so we look, and we pass judgment. Rather than expose oneself to public scrutiny, an artist may be tempted to keep his art to himself. It is not good to desire recognition, and any artist who has a proper sense of history should be able to see that his art probably does not merit recognition. And even if it did, good art is unlikely to receive very much in this day and age. The world's judgment is often mistaken. The world has even been known to put an innocent man to death and allow a murderous insurrectionist to go free, which is exactly what happened to art in the 20th century. Art is dead, announced Andy Warhol in 1963, and the art world has washed its hands by claiming that there is no such thing as right and wrong or good and evil. Justice is whatever the Roman procurator says it is, and art is whatever the art world says it is. Just to prove the point, our museums put canned excrement on display, and if you don't like it, too bad, because might makes right. All there is power. If you don't have any, tough luck. By exhibiting a banana taped to a wall or marketing a finger painting by Matisse for millions of dollars, the art world asks rhetorically, why does anything have value but because one values it? Does value not come from an evaluator? For 100 years, art has been used to communicate the power of modern man to collapse objective reality into a flat plane on which to paint his own fictitious values like a Nietzschean Übermensch. Without meaning to broach controversy, it is difficult for an artist to avoid controversy because a painting is not just an object of disinterested pleasure, an instrument for making money, or paint on a flat plane. Art is not just a way of making things, but a way of knowing things, which is bound to be controversial because truth is an imposition. No less than science, art is a way of knowing reality, and therefore a way of dispelling illusions. No less than technology, art is a way of constructing a human world on the solid ground of human nature. As the Renaissance humanist would say, nothing human is foreign to me. Yet I am not at home in the world set up by modern and postmodern artists, because I find it inhuman. Rightly considered, this homelessness is no cause for misery, but a calling to artists of the 21st century to set up another world. This may sound grandiose, but it needn't be, because one need not presume to create reality. An artist need do no more than what artists have always done. I just paint what artists used to paint. I think the way that artists used to think. I inhabit the very same world which Renaissance artists inhabited, and so it is only natural for me to paint like them. I have nothing more to give than what I have received. My pictorial inventions reflect my personal rediscovery of a reality which has never really left us, truths which have not changed because they cannot change. Art is not just a name. It is the origin of the work of art, to quote Martin Heidegger. I do nothing more than return in all humility to the origin. Taking leave of Duchamp's upside-down urinal, I go to the true source and fountain, with confidence that art will rise again from the living waters.